Another year, another worst to best list release way too late. But just because there is a lot going on right now, I am going to give myself a little bit of a break. I know people like that I cover as many films as I can find each year, but at least for the worst half, I really do not have the will or energy to give any attention to films that I don't want to give any attention to, at least in depth. Though the bigger difference this year is that I am not going to be doing my musical transitions because I am tired of dodging 500 copyright claims each year. So I hope you'll forgive me for the more casual rundown this year, but still starting from the bottom, especially since we already know what's worse this year. Megamind 2 is overtly atrocious for expectations alone. It didn't need to be a death knell that this was even made by DreamWorks Television Animation or even a series, because not even 10 years ago, DreamWorks Television was decently respectable for turning series out of its beloved franchises. And certainly that last-minute finish line that was Moana 2 makes them look back at what they could have had if they had given even a little bit of a shit. A lot of people complain loudly about not hiring back Will Ferrell, but that is easily the least of this movie's problems. You definitely could have done just as well with better affordable voice actors, not this guy who's pretty unremarkable, but not helped by the fact that he's given some pretty terrible dialogue. But 2,000,000% more, the real problem was not properly animating Megamind's face, which is absolutely lifeless in comparison. Just the fact that he seems to so rarely smile, and when he does, the smile never reaches his eyes. Even the premise isn't necessarily terrible, about a once villain, now good guy needing to confront and trick his former villain team, but the clever subversion and wit of the first movie is just gone. And without Megamind's overdramatic energy, which this animation is incapable of giving him, and with his technical genius supplanting his common sense and tendency to constantly mispronounce things, Megamind comes off as just kind of an idiot. And it really cannot be said enough. How on earth did a movie that used to look like this have a sequel a decade and a half later that is one of the worst looking things of the entire year? Not that it's the only disappointing addition to a beloved franchise, though maybe slightly less surprising. SpongeBob movies really do seem to get worse every time. I wasn't sure what the Sandy Cheeks Saves Bikini Bottom movie could have done to warrant such initial negative reviews, and the truth is, like so many, it's just that it continues to fall below SpongeBob standards. A few years ago, I made Sponge on the Run my second from the bottom, and while that was relative to whatever I was comparing it to, it does seem harsh in comparison to this, where at least the animation in that movie was nice. And it did make me laugh occasionally, it was just largely unengaging. Where the Sandy Cheeks movie isn't nearly as well animated, its celebrity cameos aren't nearly as charming, it was a red flag right away when it opens with a song about Sandy's two primary character traits, science and Texas. The entire movie is just those two words said very loudly over and over. She goes to Texas to investigate the science people she's been working for 20 years, whose reveal puts a giant stain on every science thing that Sandy has ever done in her existence as a character. Massive retcons are never very popular, even if this is pretty inconsequential. In the process, meeting her family, which turns out is a bunch of crazy circus squirrels, because the Texas cowboy stereotype would have been too on the nose. Not to mention, it can be easy to forget that SpongeBob is even in this movie, as his handful of okay lines are just constantly being pushed aside for less funny original side characters. This is another one that just feels exceptionally low grade, but at least it keeps up the illusion that 2D SpongeBob is mostly vastly superior. Now honestly, My Freaky Family is probably worse, it's only that being original means it didn't have any expectations to amend with. There really isn't any reason why I even gave this movie a glance, but on occasion I do like seeing how even some low-grade kiddie fantasy films come up with their own magic lore, because sometimes it's interesting. I liked the idea that these parents literally made their children with varying degrees of magic, so their kids are essentially a zombie, creepy twins, and a dog. All except our protagonist is different because she was made the natural way. So she doesn't have any magic, but as a result, her story has way more to do with her bloodline, which is the gross eugenics way to pull the Chosen One card. Basically, there's a war between mages and bards, her parents are one of each. And somewhere some D&D people find that very funny. This one probably actually wins for being the worst looking. The villain is this spider wraith that might actually be one of the scariest things this year if it was remotely decently animated. Thelma the Unicorn, based on a children's book, is a Netflix film about a horse who wants to be a singer in one of those universes where people and talking animals live alongside each other, but animals also have no clothes and live in fences somehow. But only gets attention when she accidentally gets mistaken for a unicorn. Cute story about superficial fame, being loved for who you really are, and the climactic chase to avoid being caught. I don't mind them expanding the premise of the book it was based on to include the musical portion. Would have mattered if the music was more memorable than it was. Really, this is just a case that to make characters more funny and kid-appealing, they just ended up making them loud and obnoxious. Hit Pig is weird. There is some appeal in the lead played by Rainn Wilson as the animal bounty hunter, but the elephant is annoying and the climax is so bizarre because it somehow managed to accumulate like half a dozen random side characters and ended up in space. Mostly unnoteworthy, but might make for a fun high watch. I know that there's an unspoken rule that we don't refer to the live-action Lion Kings as animated, even though they are, but it's partially because even the creators don't want them to be known as animated. I will take an actual live-action movie that shows infinitely more love for animation, like Hundreds of Beavers, over an animated movie that is ashamed of the fact that it's animated. But it's not like they're winning any animation category awards, and at least now, Inside Out 2 has taken that box office title away from the first one. And I won't ever hesitate to take an opportunity to put a Disney remake on the worst list. I did take an unnecessary amount of glee as Mufasa was stampeded by Sonic 3 at the box office, though now it has surpassed it at least worldwide. Damn it, Sonic, I was rooting for you. I know the response has gradually gotten more positive. I get the intrigue of this actually being a original story and not a copy, and I don't care. Like every Disney remake, yes, it has moments, and the animation has maybe improved somewhat by at least embracing more color, but the characters are still largely unexpressive, and half the time I don't know which character is talking. But if the question is if I would say that this was a good movie if it was only 2D animated, as some scenes already have been, I would like it a little more, but narratively, this still reeks of desperation and mediocrity. This is the movie that Lin-Manuel Miranda decided to give his time to, though he may not have had any choice. And while the songs in it do trounce Wish, I can't say that any of those songs left a huge impression, and it's probably because of the story they had to work off of. Because this Mufasa origin story, though let's be honest, the real hook is that it's a Scar origin story, just makes all of the most boring story choices. Starting with that Scar and Mufasa are not really brothers. That way, we can't blame Mufasa's parents, but we can blame Scar's for constantly comparing him to the stray they picked up for just being so effortlessly good at everything, and Scar just being a notorious scaredy cat and also kind of an idiot. But of course, the real reason was a girl. Of course it was. He wanted to date Sarabi. Mufasa was the ultimate honorable wingman, but she really liked him because, you know, he's perfect and good at everything, and that's why Scar is evil. God, I hate everything about this story. And that's not even addressing the ending where, despite knowing that his brother betrayed him, Mufasa decides to keep him by his side, but assigns him the name Scar to remind him of what he did. Wow, he was just begging to be assassinated. It also obnoxiously keeps trying to tie in as many references or setups to the next movie as it possibly can.
There will be one Lion King.
Yeah, I know that Wicked does the same thing, but Wicked is at least entertaining to watch. I know that there have been some people who have said that they've enjoyed it. I never want to take that away from anyone. And at this point, I actually do sort of want to have a conversation, considering that we are concluding a decade of these live-action Disney remakes, even though some of them did start earlier, and about how the younger viewers who now grew up with some of these movies feel about them. I know that Beauty and the Beast has a lot of people attached to it for some reason, though at least my impression is that comparison to their animated originals, most still prefer the animated one, which is why it just makes it all the more enraging how the remakes make 3 times as much money, while the creators of the original movies get absolutely nothing. I must really not remember Despicable Me 3, as I was so underwhelmed by this movie, I couldn't believe when people said that 3 was worse. I remember the villain from that movie, I don't remember anything about the villain from this one. Though in this case, maybe the impact of the 4th Despicable Me was contrasted by how much I actually liked Minions 2. There are a couple of moments where Gru is getting out-villained by a child that did have its perks. However, I just found Despicable Me 4 to be boring and aimless. This was a movie where I just couldn't stop glancing at my watch. Even as animation saved many a box office this year, to honestly have this movie be in the year's top 5 is just kind of depressing. Especially since Illumination has proven itself to make not amazing stuff, but its reputation was as a fun factory, and this is just not a very fun movie. And then to have legions of fans defend it with, but all the villains came back at the end to sing a cringy song. Just why? Why is that enough for you? That is the definition of a scene you could watch as a YouTube clip without the rest of the movie. And I know, it's still weird that my main takeaway and investment in this film was on the back and forth of whether the series would age up the girls. But also because, not kidding, that was literally my dominant idea for the franchise after I saw the first one a decade and a half ago. How would a former bad guy deal with his children wanting to be bad guys is a legitimately interesting idea, and of course Illumination would never have the guts to properly explore it. A fully animated Garfield movie was something I could totally be on board with, and even wanted at one point. But I am baffled that this is so un-Garfield. His characterization is technically in the ballpark, mostly because of visual signifiers. But why is this a lost father story, when the dynamic between John and Garfield is the soul of Garfield, and I can only attest it's because the dynamic in comic form tends to be a hostile one, and they didn't want Garfield to this age group to be too mean-spirited. So to fill the rest of the movie up with generic Hollywood CGI shenanigans, it remains a passable as a laxative film, and the underwhelming box office speaks for itself. Still, it does bother me when the animated versions make so much less than the hybrids, when they are objectively better, or at least better looking. Kung Fu Panda 4. Great action scenes as usual, and bearable overall, but a major letdown of a villain reunion, a giant middle finger to the Furious 5, confirming my disdain for overpaying for famous voice actors. Why is Poe retiring as the Dragon Warrior when he's got another movie coming out? And is there ever going to be a threshold in his life that Shifu doesn't have to drag him across? I don't have time for the half an hour of baggage to go into Spellbound. Suffice it to say that it is a little bit better than the average review might have you believe, but I am also perfectly okay with it dying in obscurity considering who's involved. Separate art from the artist and all that, but at some point, if you do want to stand up for something, have it for something that's worthwhile. If someone were to watch War of the Rohirrim on its own, especially if you're a fan of Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings, you might actually find some parts of it enjoyable. It does take a lot of the aesthetics from it, including the designs and the music. I will push back a little against the people who insist that this is worse than the Hobbit movies, though it does depend on what you didn't like about them. I mean, there's not any CGI eyesore at the very least, but the story comes from, like most recent Lord of the Rings works, an expansion on a brief sighting in the appendices about the siege of Helm's Deep and the death of King of Rohan Helm Hammerhand, who is a pretty cool and badass character, and if nothing else, he is the reason to see this movie. However, the framing and bookended narration of the film tries to surround the events of this movie around his daughter Hera, as well as making her an action heroine, and you can imagine how that's gone down with the predictable people. Thing is, I can understand how this story manifested given how it's presented in the appendices. The Dunlin Lord Freka asking for Helm's daughter's hand in marriage for his son was the inciting incident for this conflict, though she was unnamed. Because this story is supposed to include his badass death, making her the observer is not the worst idea. The problem with her being the lead is the disparity between how much the movie tries to treat her like she's the lead, like in the beginning and closing narrations, her name appears in no tales, which is technically true, and how much she actually does in the movie. By having her be at the center of a lot of the movie's events, like her betrothal being the spark that ultimately lights the fire for the siege, and then her being kidnapped, making the situation worse. But then Hera herself is mostly just kind of watching everything happen around her until the fight at the very end, which after hyping her up for almost the entire movie, verifies that the one form of fighting she knows how to do is uninterrupted one-on-one duels, which is fundamentally useless in a siege. But this is supposed to be a distraction, but then obviously even when she wins, his army just kind of moves around her, so That just makes it all seem very sad. There's also the scene where she leads the rampaging Oliphant to be eaten by the Watcher in the lake. There's no reason for that, it's just another scene they put in to show that she did a thing. I guess the scene's justification is just the subjective cool factor for the viewer. Also, her handmaiden is a former S.H.I.E.L.D. maiden, and she's pretty neat, but just goes to show, yeah, she could have been a side character and done just as well. However, the story as presented would certainly be a lot more palatable if it was just half an hour shorter. This film was directed by Kenji Kamiyama of Ghost in the Shell standalone complex and Eden of the East, and I can certainly feel a skill and prestige in the execution. However, it also feels like an anime from the 80s in maybe both the good but also bad ways, and that all of the animation effort is put into a handful of action scenes, but then you really feel that quality drop in the dialogue scenes where they feel deliberately drawn out, with plenty of those parody-worthy gaps of silence that feel very unnatural in English. And that is the element about this movie that is truly disappointing and potentially rage-worthy, as it has already been a talking point that this movie was essentially made just so New Line could retain the rights. And despite all of the possibilities to do a movie in the world of Middle-earth and in animation, this decision to make this an anime, aside from the realistic aesthetic, which no American studio had famously built a proper fanbase for yet, was to do this as cheaply as possible. And while there are some cool-looking scenes, I really can feel the limitation in the animation. Like, easily, I think the most accidentally hilarious part is right at the start, where it opens on the drawn map of Middle-earth, and then it fades into the very realistic mountain range, and then all of a sudden there's a very cartoonish eagle. Like, what? Also, no one likes to hear that the problem with the female lead is that she should smile more, but this movie does have a problem with every character basically having one singular expression. Admittedly, this does feel like a movie that would have become a cult classic if it had been made in the 80s, though if it truly was one, it easily would have been way more graphic. This is also yet another film, naturally, as part of a franchise, that tries a little too hard to remind you of the original films. Not nearly as bad as The Lion King, but especially there's an ending scene where they're like, we're gonna go see a wizard, and you should have just ended it there. But no, you had to follow that up with, what's his name? He has many names. Okay, leave it there. Long pause. But right now, he's known as Gandalf. Oh, you bitch. You also probably heard that they used Christopher Lee archival footage, which I cannot be in favor of unless it was specifically cited in his will that he wanted that, because it was absolutely useless in this film. Not necessary whatsoever, it was literally just a reference. I would not say that this movie was as bad as some are saying. No, it doesn't feel like it's a movie that's necessary, but how many movies made right now are? And it definitely is a movie that feels more disappointing if you're watching it in theaters, but probably would be less so if you watched it at home. But especially the ending and the length does nothing to help. Seriously, half an hour shorter would be a world of change. Yes, Moana 2 is not awful as its own movie, but I still highly dislike the nature of its existence. This movie starting as a series didn't necessarily need to be a death nail. If there were just slightly better workarounds, the work that had already been done, or the use of its characters, to feel more cohesive and not so episodic, if nothing else, to have its new featured villain be an actual reoccurring villain in the story. But no, that's too much effort for modern Disney. The animation that's been done is the animation we're using. We're absolutely not doing it again, even if it makes for a better story. But it is still my personal point of irritance that after Wish failed, principally because it had terrible music, or at least because it didn't know how to do musical storytelling properly, that Disney, basically just did that again, just slightly less bad this time. At some point, really just have to admit the musical Broadway appreciation that once existed in the Disney studio is just gone. But really the big problem for me isn't so much that this movie doesn't do anything that terrible, it's that this movie doesn't seem to do anything that good either. Just everything about it feels hollow and half-assed to me. My only hope is that now, since they know that Moana is their golden goose on a level that even live-action reboots aren't anymore, come on guys, if we just don't go see Stitch, maybe it'll stop. That we know there's going to be a Moana 3, and at least then, that is actually going to be a movie from conception, so that time they at least won't have to deal with all the baggage from the series production. And we're ending this part in an entry from a franchise that's very personal to me, Red vs. Blue Restoration. Okay, this might take a while. Red vs. Blue was one of the first successful web series of the early internet's existence in the early 2000s and the birth of Rooster Teeth. However, they announced that Season 19 Restoration was going to be its last, because RVB seasons are essentially movies, at the same time that they announced that Rooster Teeth was going to close its studios after being shut down by Warner Brothers. Thankfully, just recently it was announced that it was ultimately bought back by Bernie Burns, one of the original founders, but at the time, this meant that Restoration symbolized a lot more than just the end of Red vs. Blue. It was the end of Rooster Teeth, so I felt like there was understandably a lot of emotion and sentiment around its release, which is code for, I think fans went really easy on Restoration as a finale. But there was another reason, because fans had become very disappointed in Red vs. Blue's recent seasons. Okay, to get really pedantic, the way Red vs. Blue seasons shape up is that blocks of seasons are separated into story sagas. 1 through 5, the original Blood Gulch Chronicles, 5 through 10, Recollection/Project Freelancer, though it's all essentially one story. 11 through 13 is the Chorus Trilogy. Season 14 is an anthology of random shorts and specials. 15 through 17 is the Shizno Paradox. 18 was a side series that the CEO decided to make Season 18, which was really stupid and basically doesn't count. Anyway, point is, most fans agree that the series peaked with the Chorus Trilogy, and that after that, it felt like the series was treading water and was essentially just being made for the sake of being made. Something even the creators selves have kind of admitted.
Sometimes you nail an ending to a beloved, albeit niche, series, only to find that you've actually got a little bit of gas left in the tank. So why not take another lap around the block 5 or 10 or even 1,000 more times?
So, they made the fascinating choice to address that many of its fans hadn't bothered to watch the most recent arc, or at least finish it, that they opted to write Restoration as a direct follow-up to Chorus, essentially making every season in the middle non-canon. And I would be more understanding of this if the story had been a little bit more solid, but even beyond that, I have a very significant beef about it. Now, Restoration, by most accounts, is very recognizably Red vs. Blue, with its mix of action, silliness, and heart. It is definitely fundamentally watchable and even enjoyable. But what this really is a goodbye to specifically the Red Team, as the joke across the entire series is that Blue Team are essentially the protagonists who do all of the story stuff, and the Reds are just the comedic tag-alongs. So this is kind of their moment.
We should sound the alarm.
Alarm for who? We're all standing right here. Who are we alarming?
And in general, I do kind of like that, even though them finally being front and center is sort of, off their brand, as it were. When the Red Team actually has to be serious, they just don't quite feel like themselves. Still, in that light, I do love the bulk of these moments. The Red Team is, of course, all brilliant together. But still, for a finale of the series, for Tucker, one of the co-protagonists, to essentially be ousted from the finale would be disappointing by itself, but the reason that he's gone is because he's been spontaneously possessed by the meta off-screen and only introduced by a church memory fragment expositing that it happened. And that's semi-connected to another issue, which is just why the meta and the memory fragments are back, and I can only believe it's for finale reasons, where it feels like solving that whole kerfuffle is just what the finale should do, because it's been such a big part of the series. Even though, I'm just gonna say it, while the meta is cool, the entire AI memory fragment aspect of Project Freelancer, in terms of how it worked, was just one of those things that never made sense. But other than that, I just don't like the entire attitude of let's just sweep the entire Shizno Paradox under the rug. Yes, it is the weakest arc of RBV for a reason, but there's still a lot of good things in it once you get away from directly comparing it to Chorus, including potentially my favorite emotional arc of the entire series around Agent Washington. Wash is one of my favorite characters out of the entire series and does essentially share protagonist duties with Tucker and Carolina. And if absolutely nothing else, 15 through 17 does amazing things for Washington's character, where he got shot in the head and the consequences of it, and especially his relationship with Carolina. This is unequivocally one of my absolute favorite hetero friendship couples of all time.
I've grown from being a dishonorable killing machine to an honorable killing machine.
It's never too late to start over again.
Do you really believe that, David?
I don't know if Rock Singer is really in your future.
It was fun to watch them squirm, though, wasn't it?
I changed my mind. You are evil.
So for season 19 to come along with this piddly replacing subplot for Wash, that everything that happened after Chorus just didn't happen, was personally unacceptable. Even more so that his entire side quest didn't even need to be in that movie. Restoration functions perfectly fine if you just focus on the red team and not bring up Wash at all, which seemed to only happen to introduce another tragic end to a character that nobody seemed to really care about. I mean, you already didn't bother to bring back Donut. Basically, this is a long-winded way of saying, if you're a fan of Red vs. Blue, only watch Restoration for the red team's conclusion. And if you have not seen seasons 15 through 17, I would definitely still give them a try. They are better than you've heard. Alright, I'll see you at the best half. Let me know which films you really want me to cover, and I will do my best.